I've always loved my work as a graphic designer. I get to create things every day. My office is small and quiet, perfect for focusing on my projects. I usually spend most of my day working on designs for clients, making sure every detail is perfect. I take pride in what I do, and even though it can be exhausting, I always feel satisfied when the day ends. But something changed in me after what happened one night when I came home from work. It was a night that would stay with me forever. It was a Friday evening, and I was ready for the weekend. I left the office around 7 p.m., later than usual, but that wasn't uncommon. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a mix of orange and purple. As I drove home, I thought about how I would spend the weekend relaxing. Maybe I'd watch a few movies, order takeout, and unwind. When I got home, I parked my car in the driveway and headed inside. My house is a small, one-story place with just enough space for me. I've lived alone here for the past 3 years. It's not in a busy area, which I like because it's quiet, and I can always find peace after a long day at work. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was dark, just as I expected. I turned on the light in the hallway and kicked off my shoes, enjoying the feeling of finally being home. The familiar scent of the house greeted me, and I felt a sense of comfort. I made my way to the living room and tossed my bag onto the couch. As I walked to the kitchen to grab a drink, something caught my eye. There was a faint light coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it might be the glow of the streetlights outside, but it was too bright for that. I had made sure to turn off all the lights before leaving for work in the morning, so this didn't make sense. I felt a slight unease, but brushed it off. Maybe I had forgotten to turn off the light. It was a long day at work after all. But as I approached the kitchen, the unease grew stronger. The light wasn't coming from the ceiling, it was coming from the direction of my refrigerator. I walked into the kitchen slowly, my footsteps soft on the floor. The light was coming from the open door of the freezer. My heart started to race. I was sure I had closed it. Who would leave a freezer door open? I didn't live with anyone. I was the only one who had a key to the house. Suddenly, the comforting quietness of my home felt eerie. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing in front of the freezer, his back to me. He was dressed in dark, dirty clothes, and his hands were inside the freezer as if he were looking for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze in place. This couldn't be real. How could someone be in my house? My mind raced with questions, but there was no time to think. Without making a sound, I slowly backed away from the kitchen. The man hadn't noticed me yet, but I didn't want to take any chances. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I moved quickly and quietly down the hallway toward my bedroom. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I turned the key. I stood there for a moment, my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was in a whirl. How did he get in? Why was he messing with my freezer? None of it made any sense. But I couldn't stay frozen in fear. I had to do something. My phone was on the nightstand by my bed. I grabbed it with shaky hands and dialed 911. My voice quivered as I explained the situation to the operator. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I kept the lights off in my room, afraid that any sign of movement might alert the man that I was there. I didn't know if he was still in the kitchen or if he had heard me leave. Every creak of the house made me jump. The silence was deafening, each second ticking by filled with tension. I tried to listen for any sound, but all I could hear was the rapid beating of my heart. After what felt like forever, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. What if the man heard them too? What if he tried to escape? Or worse, come after me? I couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling. Finally, I heard the sound of the front door being forced open, followed by heavy footsteps. The police had arrived. I unlocked my bedroom door and slowly opened it, peeking out into the hallway. I could see the beam of a flashlight scanning the walls as the officers searched the house. I stepped into the hallway, relief flooding through me. "I'm here," I called back, my voice shaking. They quickly moved toward me, asking if I was okay and if I had seen the intruder. I explained everything, from the light in the kitchen to the man in the freezer. The officers searched every corner of the house, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him, not even a trace that he had been there. The police told me that it wasn't uncommon for burglars to break into homes looking for easy targets, but something about the whole situation felt off. Why was he interested in my freezer? Why didn't he take anything else? I didn't have answers, only questions that haunted me long after that night. I installed security cameras the next day and changed all the locks, but the fear stayed with me. Every time I came home from work, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be inside waiting. The once comforting silence of my home now felt heavy, filled with the memory of that night. I never saw the man again, but I always wondered who he was, what he wanted. The police never found him, and the case went cold. But for me, the fear never went away. I still love my work, but now coming home isn't the same. The safety and peace I once felt in my house are gone, replaced by the lingering fear of the unknown. Working late at the office had become a routine for me. My name is James, and I work as an accountant at a small firm. The office was quiet at night, with only the sound of my fingers tapping on the keyboard. The overhead lights cast long shadows, making the place seem even more deserted. It was the kind of silence that made you notice every small sound, like the hum of the air conditioner or the creak of the old wooden floor. It was a Thursday night, and I had a deadline to meet. The others had left hours ago, and I was the only one still at my desk. I was focused on my work, trying to wrap things up so I could finally go home. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., and I was starting to feel the weight of the day. My eyes were heavy, and my back ached from sitting too long. As I worked, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was a flicker of movement, something that made me stop and look up. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as my tired mind playing tricks on me and went back to my work. But the feeling that something was off stayed with me. The air seemed heavier and the silence more oppressive. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the late hour getting to me. About 15 minutes later, just as I was considering calling it a night, I heard a noise outside the office door. It was faint at first, a shuffling sound, like someone moving around. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in my chair, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time, like footsteps. My first thought was that maybe someone had forgotten something and come back to get it. But who would return at this hour? I slowly got up from my chair, my movements cautious. I walked over to the office door and pressed my ear against it. The footsteps had stopped, and there was only silence. I hesitated, not sure whether I should open the door or stay inside. Part of me wanted to just pack up and leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. Just as I reached for the door handle, there was a loud bang followed by a shout. My hand froze in midair. "Hands up," someone yelled. The voice was authoritative, and I knew immediately it was the police. My heart raced, and 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. Why were the police here? What had happened? I slowly opened the door, my hands trembling. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, their guns drawn and pointed in my direction. The sight of the guns made my blood run cold. I raised my hands instinctively, confusion and fear washing over me. "What's going on?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you alone?" one of the officers asked, his eyes scanning the office behind me. "Yes," I replied, my voice shaky. "I'm the only one here." The officers didn't lower their weapons. Instead, one of them stepped forward and motioned for me to move aside. "Stay where you are," he ordered. "We're here because we received a report of a break-in." My heart pounded even harder. A break-in in the office? I glanced around as if expecting to see the intruder standing right there in plain sight, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual clutter of papers and office equipment. "I didn't hear anything," I said, my mind racing. Had someone broken in while I was working? "We saw a man enter the building," the other officer explained. He was seen heading toward this office. The officer's words sent a chill through me. I had been so engrossed in my work that I hadn't even noticed. I stepped back, allowing the officers to enter the office. They moved quickly, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. One of them checked behind the desk, while the other looked in the small storage room at the back. I stood near the doorway, my hands still raised, feeling completely out of control. "Stay calm," one of the officers said as he continued his search. "We'll find him." I watched as they methodically searched the office, opening every cupboard and looking under every piece of furniture. The minutes felt like hours, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in the middle of a bad dream. I kept thinking about how close the intruder must have been, how he could have been watching me while I worked. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the officers called out, "Over here." His voice was urgent, and I could see the tension in his posture. He was crouched down, looking under one of the desks near the back of the office. I held my breath as the other officer rushed over to him. They both peered under the desk, and then I saw it, the shadow of a figure hidden beneath. My stomach turned as I realized that the intruder had been in the office with me the entire time. "Come out slowly," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm. The figure under the desk didn't move at first, but then slowly, a man crawled out. He was disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. His eyes were wide with fear as the officers pulled him to his feet and handcuffed him. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and gaunt. I stood there, frozen, as the officers led the man out of the office. He didn't say a word, just stared blankly ahead as they took him away. The whole thing felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but it was real, terrifyingly real. After the police left with the intruder, I sat back down at my desk, my hands still shaking. The office felt different now, no longer the familiar place I had spent so many late nights in. It felt tainted, as if the shadows had come to life and swallowed up the safety I once felt here. I didn't finish my work that night. I couldn't. The thought of staying in that office for even one more minute was unbearable. I grabbed my things and left, the cold night air hitting me as I stepped outside. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but the fear lingered. That night changed the way I saw the office. I couldn't bring myself to stay late anymore, not after what had happened. The thought of that man hiding just a few feet away from me, watching me while I worked, still haunts me. I can't help but wonder what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. I love traveling, and Airbnb is my go-to for finding unique places to stay. One summer, I wanted a break from city life, so I booked a small cabin in the woods. The pictures on the site showed a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by tall trees. The reviews were positive, praising the owner, Mr. Bolt, for being kind and helpful. I didn't think twice before booking it. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. The road became narrow and winding as I got closer. Trees towered over me, their branches reaching out like long fingers. The sunlight barely broke through the thick leaves, casting a dim greenish light on the path ahead. I could feel the air getting cooler, and a sense of isolation slowly crept in. But I told myself this was the peace I wanted. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as it did in the photos. It was charming, with a small porch and a rocking chair. Flowers grew in neat rows by the front steps, adding a splash of color to the otherwise dark surroundings. I parked my car and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Mr. Bolt appeared from behind the cabin. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with a friendly smile and kind eyes. He wore a plaid shirt, jeans, and a straw hat that looked well worn. He greeted me warmly and helped me with my bags. "You'll love it here," he said as he showed me around. His voice was gentle, like the soothing rustle of leaves in the wind. He pointed out the small kitchen, the cozy living room with a fireplace, and the bedroom with a large window that overlooked the forest. Everything was simple, but comfortable, just what I needed. As I settled in, Mr. Bolt told me to let him know if I needed anything. He lived nearby and was always available to help. I thanked him, feeling reassured by his kindness. That first evening was peaceful. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the sky turned a deep shade of blue. I went inside, lit a fire in the fireplace, and curled up with a book. The warmth of the flames and the crackling sound made me feel cozy and safe. But as the night wore on, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. The cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering in the firelight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. The forest was dense, with tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. I followed a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. The only sound was the crunching of leaves as I walked. I didn't see anyone else, which wasn't surprising given how remote the cabin was, but the silence felt different today, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was nothing. Still, the unease lingered. When I returned to the cabin, Mr. Bolt was there, tending to the flowers. He greeted me with the same warm smile, but something in his eyes looked different. They were darker, more intense. I brushed it off, blaming my nerves. That evening, I decided to relax by the fire again. As I sat there, I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, like something moving through the leaves. I listened carefully, and the sound grew louder and closer. My heart began to race. The noise stopped right outside the door. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal passing by. I went to bed, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay there, frozen, as the footsteps stopped outside my door. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Bolt, but something was different. His kind eyes were gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying stare. His face seemed twisted, as if two different people were fighting to control it. One side looked like the friendly man I had met, while the other was distorted, angry, and menacing. I realized I was trapped in this remote cabin with him. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with thoughts of how to escape, but I was too scared to move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and left. I could hear his footsteps fading as he walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before I grabbed my phone and called the police. My hands trembled as I explained where I was and what had happened. The police arrived quickly, considering how far away the cabin was. They found Mr. Bolt in the woods, hiding among the trees. When they arrested him, they discovered he had a history of mental illness and had been living in the woods for years, pretending to be different people. The kind Mr. Bolt was just one of his personalities. The other was something far more dangerous. As I drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The cabin, the woods, and Mr. Bolt were all behind me, but the memory of that twisted face stayed with me. I will never forget when I realized the man who had seemed so kind was hiding something terrifying. A few weeks ago, I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest. I had been working hard and needed some time to clear my head. The idea of being surrounded by nature, with no one around, was comforting. So I packed my gear and drove out to a forest I had heard about from a friend. It was far from the city, and not many people knew about it, which made it the perfect spot for some peace. When I arrived at the forest, the sun was still high in the sky. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves creating a beautiful green canopy above. The air was fresh, and I could hear birds singing in the distance. There was a small creek nearby, and the sound of the water flowing over the rocks was soothing. I found a nice spot to set up my camp near the creek, surrounded by tall pines. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire, and sat down to enjoy the view. As the sun began to set, the forest became even more peaceful. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, and the air grew cooler. I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, enjoying the warmth of the flames. As the night grew darker, the stars started to appear, twinkling brightly above the treetops. It was a perfect night, and I felt at ease being alone in the wilderness. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The crickets were chirping, and now and then I could hear the rustle of leaves as small animals moved around in the underbrush. It was calm and quiet, just the way I liked it. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. The night was cool, but I was warm and comfortable inside the tent. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to the sound of voices outside my tent. At first, I thought I was dreaming. But then I realized that the voices were real. My heart started to race. As I lay still listening, two men were standing just outside my camp. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them talking in low voices. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" one of them asked. His voice was deep and rough. "Yes, this is it. I saw him set up his camp here earlier," the other man replied. His voice was quieter, almost nervous. I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead as I listened. Who were these men? What did they want? I stayed as quiet as possible, hoping they would go away. "Look, I think we should just kill him," the first man said, his voice cold and emotionless. "It's easier, and no one will find him out here." My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These men were talking about killing me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I make a run for it? Should I try to scare them off? I didn't know if they had weapons, and the thought of running into the darkness was terrifying. "No," the second man said firmly. "We're not killing anyone tonight. We'll find someone else, someone easier. Let's just leave him alone." For a moment, there was silence. I held my breath, waiting to hear what they would do next. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was afraid they might hear it. "Fine," the first man finally said, his voice filled with frustration. "But if we don't find anyone else, we're coming back." I heard them walking away, their footsteps fading into the distance. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, waiting for what felt like hours until I was sure they were gone. My mind was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. Eventually, I dared to sit up in my tent, listening carefully for any signs that they might return. All I could hear was the sound of the creek and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, my thoughts racing. What if they came back? What if they found someone else? The fear kept me alert, my mind replaying their conversation over and over. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I quickly packed up my camp. I didn't want to stay in that forest for another minute. The beauty of the place that had once comforted me now felt sinister and dangerous. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. As I made my way back to my car, the forest seemed different. The trees that had once seemed so majestic now felt like they were closing in on me. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those men watching me from the shadows. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away from the forest. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road. Even then, the memory of those men's voices haunted me. Camping alone had always been something I enjoyed, but after that night, I wasn't sure if I could ever do it again. The carnival was my escape from the everyday world. I was just a young boy when I started working there, a place full of colors, lights, and excitement. The music played loud, blending with the sound of laughter, the hum of the rides, and the sweet scent of cotton candy filling the air. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, making the carnival lights glow even brighter. I worked at the game booths, where people lined up to test their luck. My job was simple: hand out the prizes, collect the tickets, and sometimes show a customer how to play the game. The games were all the same: ring toss, shooting hoops, knocking down bottles, but the smiles on the faces of those who won kept it exciting. I liked watching their eyes light up when they won a stuffed bear or a shiny toy. It made me feel like I was part of something special. But as the night went on, the carnival began to change. The bright, cheerful atmosphere took on a different tone. The shadows grew longer, and the noise seemed to dull, turning into a low murmur. The people still laughed and cheered, but something felt off. It was as if the carnival had two sides, one that was fun and lively during the day, and another that was dark and eerie at night. It was a late evening when I first noticed him. He was standing near the edge of the carnival, just outside the circle of lights. He was tall and thin, with a face hidden in the shadows. He didn't join the crowd, didn't play any games or ride the rides. He just stood there, watching. I tried to ignore him at first. After all, people came to the carnival for all sorts of reasons. Maybe he was just shy or waiting for someone. But as the night went on, I kept seeing him. No matter where I was, whether I was at the ring toss, helping a kid with the dart game, or taking a break near the food stands, I felt his eyes on me. I began to feel uneasy. My skin prickled every time I caught sight of him. He stayed in the shadows, always watching, always there. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there for me, that he was following me. The carnival started to close, the lights dimmed one by one, the music fading into the background. The crowd thinned out, and the once lively place became eerily quiet. I packed up the booth, trying to keep my hands from shaking. The man was still there, standing just outside the glow of the last few lights. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I hurried through my work, wanting nothing more than to leave, to get away from the carnival and the man who was watching me. As I walked towards the exit, I glanced back one last time. The man was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I turned around, he was standing there, just a few feet away. His face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart raced, and I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stood frozen, staring at the man as he slowly stepped closer. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, like he knew he had all the time in the world. I didn't know what he wanted, and I didn't want to find out. Somehow, I managed to move my legs. Finally obeying, I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to see if he was following. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I sprinted through the now empty carnival. I reached the main road, the lights of the carnival far behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stopped, doubling over to catch my breath. I was safe, far away from the carnival and the man who had been watching me. But the fear lingered, making my hands tremble and my stomach twist. I walked home that night, the darkness around me feeling more oppressive than ever. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there, following me, but the road was empty, and I was alone. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me, checking it twice to make sure it was secure. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, didn't want to admit that I had been scared by a man who might have been just another carnival goer. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. He was something else, something that didn't belong in the bright, happy world of the carnival. The next day, I went back to work, trying to push the memory of the man out of my mind. But the carnival didn't feel the same anymore. The colors weren't as bright, the music wasn't as cheerful, and the shadows seemed darker than before. I kept looking for him, expecting to see him standing in the same spot, watching me, but he was gone. The carnival moved on to the next town a few days later, and I left with it. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can still feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking, following me through the shadows of the carnival, and I still haven't told anyone. Some things are better left unsaid. In 2019, my grandmother became very sick. She had always been healthy and full of life, but now she was in the hospital, and the doctors were saying that she might not make it. It was a hard time for my family. We all loved Grandma so much, and the thought of losing her was too painful to imagine. One evening, my parents decided to visit Grandma in the hospital. She wasn't doing well, and they wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. My mom and dad asked if I wanted to come with them, but I felt nervous about seeing her like that, so I told them I would stay home. They didn't argue. They knew how I felt, and they promised they wouldn't be gone too long. Before they left, my mom gave me a big hug and told me to lock all the doors and windows. "We'll be back soon," she said. "Call us if you need anything." After they left, the house felt eerily quiet. The silence made me a little uneasy. but I tried to push the feeling away. I decided to watch a movie to take my mind off things. I grabbed a blanket and settled on the couch, picking a movie I had seen a million times before, something light and funny. Just what I needed to forget about everything for a little while. As I watched the movie, I began to relax. The familiar scenes made me feel a little better, and I even started to laugh at the jokes. But then, something strange happened. About halfway through the movie, I felt a weird sensation, like something wasn't right. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, but it made my heart race a little. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I was just being paranoid because I was alone in the house, but the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger. It was as if someone was watching me. I looked around the room, but everything seemed normal. The doors were still locked, and the windows were closed. I tried to focus on the movie again, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a soft noise. It was faint, like a whisper or a quiet rustle, and it seemed to be coming from right beneath me. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, listening carefully. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound was coming from under the couch. Slowly, I pulled the blanket closer and leaned forward. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, but I knew I had to check. The space under the couch was dark, and for a moment I thought maybe I was imagining things. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. Movement. There was something, or rather someone, under the couch. I gasped and quickly moved back, almost falling off the couch in my panic. My mind raced. Who was under there? How did they get in? 1,000 questions filled my head, but there was no time to think. I had to get out of the house. I jumped off the couch and ran to the front door as fast as I could. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, but I finally managed to get the door open. I bolted out of the house, not even bothering to close the door behind me. My only thought was to get as far away as possible. I ran to my neighbor's house, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I pounded on their door, praying they were home. After what felt like forever, the door opened, and Mrs. Green, my elderly neighbor, appeared. She looked at me with concern. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked. "There's someone in my house," I blurted out, unable to keep the fear out of my voice. Mrs. Green's eyes widened, and she quickly ushered me inside. She locked the door behind us and immediately called the police. As we waited for them to arrive, she tried to calm me down, but I was too scared to think straight. My mind kept replaying the image of that figure under the couch. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. They were quick and professional, searching the house from top to bottom. I stayed at Mrs. Green's, watching from the window as the officers moved through my house with flashlights. But after what felt like hours, they came back with unsettling news. They didn't find anyone. The man under the couch was gone. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police assured me that the house was safe, but I could tell they were as puzzled as I was. They didn't know how he had gotten in. My parents came home soon after the police left. They were shocked and terrified when they heard what had happened. My mom hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes, while my dad talked to the officers, trying to make sense of it all. But there were no answers. The man's intentions remained a mystery. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept thinking about the man under the couch. Who was he? What did he want? The questions haunted me, and the fact that we would never know the answers made it even worse. I couldn't stay home alone for a long time after that, and even now, I'm always extra careful about locking doors and windows. The memory of that night still lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't explain. It was 2020. I decided to take a break from my busy life and spend some time alone in nature. I packed my RV van with everything I needed and drove deep into the forest. The air was cool and the tall trees surrounded me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It felt like the perfect place to unwind and clear my mind. The forest was peaceful, and I thought a few days here would do me good. I found a spot that seemed just right. Quiet, secluded, and far from any other campers. I parked my RV in a small clearing where the trees formed a natural wall around me. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. I set up a small fire outside, cooked some dinner, and enjoyed the evening sounds of the forest. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. As the night grew darker, I put out the fire and went inside the RV. The interior was cozy, with a small bed, a table, and a few chairs. I locked the door and drew the curtains, shutting out the dark forest. The only light inside came from a small lamp on the table. I changed into my pajamas, climbed into bed, and wrapped myself in a warm blanket. I felt safe inside the RV, with the thick metal walls protecting me from the outside world. It was just after midnight when I heard the first sound, a soft knock on the window beside my bed. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. The knock was gentle, almost like someone tapping with their fingers, but it was loud enough to wake me up. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. The forest outside was silent. No wind, no animals, nothing but that knock. I hesitated, unsure if I should check. Maybe it was just a branch tapping against the window, but something about it didn't feel right. Slowly, I got out of bed and walked to the window. I pulled the curtain back just a little, enough to peek outside. There was nothing there, just the dark trees standing still under the pale moonlight. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking I must have imagined it. I closed the curtain and went back to bed, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining to catch any sound. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, I wasn't sure, but just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again. The same soft knock on the window. This time it was followed by another sound, a low, faint crying. It was distant at first, like it was coming from far away, but then it grew louder, closer. The sound was eerie, sending a chill through me. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The crying was unlike anything I'd ever heard, soft, sorrowful, like someone was in deep pain. I couldn't ignore it. I had to see what was going on. I got out of bed and walked back to the window. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. Slowly I pulled it back. What I saw made my blood run cold. Outside the window, just a few feet away, stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and thin, with long, stringy hair hanging over its face. The figure was barely visible in the darkness, but its eyes, those eyes, were large, glowing white, and staring straight at me. They were the most terrifying eyes I had ever seen, wide open, unblinking, and full of something I couldn't understand. Anger? Fear? I couldn't tell, but whatever it was, it made me back away from the window in terror. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring at me, the crying sound coming from its direction. I felt my heart beating so fast, I thought it might burst. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I run, hide, call for help? But deep down I knew there was only one thing I could do. I rushed to the front of the RV, my hands shaking as I grabbed the keys. I fumbled with them, my fingers almost too numb with fear to turn the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I threw the RV into gear. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the RV lurched forward, speeding out of the clearing and onto the narrow forest road. The tires kicked up dirt and gravel as I drove as fast as I could, the headlights cutting through the dark trees that seemed to close in around me. The road twisted and turned, but I didn't slow down. My only thought was to get out of the forest, away from that thing, whatever it was. The RV bounced over the rough road, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the edge of the forest. The trees thinned out, and the open road stretched ahead of me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town miles away. Only then did I pull over, my hands still shaking, my heart pounding. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light, a shadow in the dark? But those eyes, I couldn't forget those eyes. They were burned into my memory, staring at me, full of something that I never wanted to see again. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. Whatever I saw that night, I didn't want to know what it was. All I know is that I was lucky to get out of there. Sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that soft knock on the window, and I remember those eyes staring back at me. I hope I never see them again. I've always been a practical man. I grew up in the city, surrounded by noise and people, so when I decided to buy a farmhouse in the countryside, everyone was surprised. The idea of living in a quiet place away from the hustle and bustle seemed perfect. I wanted to escape the chaos and live a simple life. The farmhouse was old, but it had character. It sat on several acres of land, with tall trees surrounding it like silent guardians. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and at night, the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days fixing up the old place, painting walls, repairing the roof, and clearing out the overgrown garden. There was something satisfying about working with my hands, and I enjoyed the quiet evenings, sitting on the porch, watching the sunset behind the hills. But then, strange things started happening. At first, I dismissed them as nothing. Old houses make noises, I told myself. They creak and groan as they settle. But soon I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. It began with small things. I would leave a tool in one room, only to find it in another. Sometimes I would hear footsteps upstairs when I knew I was alone in the house. They were soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. I would rush upstairs, only to find nothing but silence. The footsteps would stop the moment I reached the top of the stairs, as if whatever was making them didn't want to be found. One night, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. The farmhouse didn't have modern conveniences, so I had to heat water on the stove and use a basin. As I was scrubbing a plate, I heard a faint whisper behind me. It was so soft that I thought I had imagined it, but I turned around, expecting to see someone. But the kitchen was empty. The whisper came again, this time closer, almost in my ear. My heart raced and I dropped the plate, which shattered on the floor. I stood there, frozen, listening, but the whispering had stopped. The only sound was the wind outside, rattling the window panes. I told myself I was just tired, that I had been working too hard, but something was in the house with me, something I couldn't see. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle of the wind made me jump. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing in on me from all sides. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining to catch any sound. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the feeling of something cold brushing against my arm. I jerked awake, sitting up in bed, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to ignore what had happened. I wasn't going to let fear get the best of me. I went about my day as usual, working on the farmhouse, and trying to push the events of the previous night out of my mind. But as evening fell, the uneasy feeling returned. I tried to stay busy, but the quiet of the house felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. I lay there, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the wind outside, and then I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it was louder, clearer. It was a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The whispering continued, growing more insistent, like someone was trying to tell me something. I got out of bed, my hands shaking, and slowly walked down the hallway. The whispering followed me, filling the air around me. It was coming from the living room. I stopped at the doorway, peering inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. But there, in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was a shadow, darker than the darkness around it. It stood there, motionless, staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. I wanted to run, to leave the farmhouse and never come back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure. It didn't move, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It was coming from the figure. I realized it was trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. Finally, I found the strength to move. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the figure. The whispering followed me as I retreated down the hallway, growing fainter with each step. I reached my bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it. I sat on the bed, my heart racing, my mind reeling. What was happening? Was I going crazy? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, staring at the door, waiting for the whispering to return, but it didn't. The house was silent, but it was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the calm before a storm. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was in this house didn't want me here. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the farmhouse. I didn't look back as I drove away, the shadowy figure and the whispering voice still fresh in my mind. I sold the farmhouse a few weeks later, without ever returning. I didn't tell the new owners about what I had experienced. Who would believe me? I hardly believed it myself. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened in that farmhouse. All I know is that something was there, something unseen and unknown, and it didn't want me there.